I'm Barry Shaw, and this is The View from Israel. Yesterday was International Holocaust Memorial Day 2025. And we find that in every Western country that adopted socialist woke governments, there has been a shocking re-emergence of violent anti-Semitism. They have, it seems, forgotten the past, replaced it with a flawed and misplaced morality, which has left Jews and its modern-day victims. One of the countries where this is becoming most threatening may shock you. That place is Australia. The story of Australian Jews, those who were not born and raised down under, is familiar to Jews everywhere. Refugees fleeing the Holocaust, fleeing Soviet persecution, fleeing crime-infested South Africa, finding they hoped safe and prosperous life in Australia down under. But in Australia, they were loyal, they were diligent, and they made their mark. The names of Monash, Lowy, Cowan echo the success and prestige of Australia in differing fields of achievement. Today's Australian Jews are living in fear and in hearing from individuals who are telling me they're prepared to pack up their bags and make Aliyah to Israel. Now, as an Israeli, I have been witness to the bonds that bound our two nations together. And I wrote about this in a book of one page of that history, 1917, From Palestine to the Land of Israel. Now, this book here tells the story of what I witnessed when I attended a very special event at a special cemetery in Beersheba on the 100th anniversary commemorating the extraordinary courage of Anzac cavalry soldiers who rode into the Turkish and German guns in World War I, winning a heroic victory that turned the tide of history. And at that event that I attended, in the cemetery where so many Aussies are buried, we witnessed the unbreakable bond between our two countries in the presence of the Prime Minister of Israel, Australia, and New Zealand, who pledged eternal kinship between us. That kinship has been destroyed by a change in a different political ideology by the current administration in Canberra. Australia opened its gates to unbridled immigration from people from the Middle East. Prime Minister Albanese and Foreign Minister Wong eagerly adopted their cultural and political beliefs by allowing them free expression to their hatred of Jews and of Israel. And at every opportunity since the 7th of October, a day in which the Hamas terror organization, representing at least 2 million Palestinians, launched a genocidal invasion of my country, Albanese and Wong have stood with their Hamas supporting migrants and denigrated Israel. In their political ignorance, the Albanese Wong government at national and local level unleashed the Jew-hating dogs of war, not only against Israel, but against their own Jews. In the morning of the 8th of September, the 8th of September in Australia, the mayoress of Sydney allowed a mass gathering by the Sydney Opera House of these new Australians who wanted to celebrate the mass slaughter, torture, rape, and hostage taking of 2,000 Israelis. They chanted, "Fuck the Jews." They chanted, "Death to Jews." They chanted, "Where are the Jews? Allah Akbar." They didn't say Israelis or Zionists, they said Jews. This is their religion. This is their belief system. And yet, when the horrors of that moment hit and the socialist mayoress of Sydney was asked how she could allow such an awful event to take place, her answer was that in Australia, free speech is allowed and protected, and people are able to gather and to protest. So I have to ask, is this an Australian value for a mass of people to gather in public and threaten Jews with death? My history reminds me of another place where people are allowed to gather and practice free speech rights by chanting death to Jews. This was Nazi Germany. And you should know exactly what happened next, because it's exactly what is happening in Australia. I don't know if any of you have visited Humboldt Square in Berlin. This square is next to the Humboldt University. It used to be Germany's finest university before the Nazis took over. And in that square, on May the 10th, 1933, they decided to burn books, Jewish books written by Jewish authors, or books about notable Jews in Europe who had contributed to German and Austrian European culture and science. And I visited Humboldt Square. There's a memorial there written by an 18th century German Jewish philosopher, Heinrich Heine. And it says, where they burn books, they eventually burn people. The next stage for the Nazis was to burn synagogues, often locking their Jews inside. This happened to my wife's family in Lithuania, who were herded into a synagogue, which they set fire to by the Nazis with all the Jews inside. Guess what? Australia, you're ahead of the Nazis. You didn't burn the books, but you're already burning the synagogues. Isn't this a warning to you? After the turn by the synagogues, they turned to the Jewish childcare centers, and now they're targeting Jews. Well done, Australia. This is what you get for the privilege of unbridled free speech, whether by the far right or the jihadi migrants who you've welcomed into your country. They are now threatening to kill prominent Australian Jews. Alex Ridley, the leader of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, had his properties vandalized with the threatening graffiti saying, "Fuck the Jews and fuck Israel." Sort of members of what happened not only in Humboldt Square, but opposite the Sydney Opera House. Alex wrote that this phenomenon won't end with arson. The question before Australians now is, will somebody get killed before it does? And that person may be my special guest, the president of the Australian Jewish Association and a friend, David Adler. David, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Barry. What a powerful and frankly frightening introduction there.
Well, I was shocked but not surprised when I heard of the death threat. Tell us how this happened, because it even horrifies me when I think about it. It came, I understand, with a hangman's noose.
The image, yes. And it's not the first time that I've received a death threat, and indeed our organisation, the Australian Jewish Association, has received numerous threats, Barry, since the 7th of October 2023. And we're very prominent on social media, and we're the largest Australian Jewish platform on Facebook, on X, on Instagram, and so we get a lot of attention from the haters. And this particular threat you're talking about was sent via social media, via Facebook, and it consisted of an image of a hangman's noose and a warning. The warning was that if we turn up to a particular committee of the Senate, which we were programmed to appear before, then we would Delta Indy Echo DIE, die. The interesting thing about this particular threat, in fact, there are a couple of interesting things about it, is that it was to try to intimidate us from engaging in Australia's political process. And the Senate committee that we were invited to give evidence before was dealing with a general subject, what sort of regulation there should be in Australia on misinformation, disinformation. Nothing specific about Israel, nothing specific at all about the Middle East conflict. And still it attracted a death threat. And the other thing which is very, very noteworthy is that recently, after a considerable delay, our law enforcement authorities seem to have got into gear, and they have traced the perpetrator of this threat. And a special unit has been established within the Australian Federal Police called Operation Avalite. And this threat led to their very first arrest just a couple of weeks ago. So they have caught the perpetrator. There is a court date set for the 26th of February, and we will obviously be watching very closely. There needs to be a conviction, there needs to be serious penalties, because at the moment, and as you sort of alluded to in your introduction, there's been no consequences for this anti-Semitism which has become violent, and there needs to be severe deterrence.
Well, in my opinion, the helping consequences, it's been encouraged, but when you say the police have caught one of the perpetrators, have they named him, or have they given anything about this person's background? Was he far right, or was he a migrant?
Well, at this stage, we don't know, Barry. All we know is what the police have said publicly, that it's a 44-year-old man from Blacktown, which is a suburb in Western Sydney. They've said nothing at all about his background. They've not named him. Obviously, additional information will have to appear before the court, and it will come as no surprise to anyone that we have alerted a journalist, and we will have likely a couple of observers at the court day.
Is this normal that somebody who has been arrested for a serious potential crime, that their identities are kept secret, or don't they think it's in the public interest to know the background of somebody who would be issuing death threats?
I would have thought that normally, but not universally, the person is named. Unless it's a minor, they don't name child offenders. But normally an adult would be identified. But sometimes in criminal matters, the identification is delayed. And I'll tell you why. Because there have been some defence lawyers, some criminal defence lawyers, who have argued for a reduced penalty on the grounds that the person has already been vilified publicly, that they've suffered various domestic damage to their reputations, to their business, to their other activities, whatever it is. So I guess the prosecution has to weigh up these things. I'm not worried that the person's identity and details have not yet been made publicly, because obviously when it goes to court, that information, unless there's a court order that it be suppressed, will be made available. I agree with the implication of your question. It is very important that we know the background and the potential motivation. Is this a neo-Nazi? Is it a Muslim with sympathies towards Hamas? Is it, is it a hired criminal? We've had rumours in Australia that there have been some overseas players, potentially Iran, who have been hiring people to carry out attacks on the Jewish community.
The police have also said that the criminal elements that have been funding anti-Semitic or things like the threats that you have there, but really, in my professional opinion, may be criminal. But I usually find, based on what's happening in other countries, it's less criminal, more ideal. The paymasters are less criminal, more ideological paymasters. Perhaps this could be at play over there in Australia as well.
It's certainly a possibility. We do know that some of the anti-Israel activists and their organisations are very well funded. There is a significant Muslim community in Australia. By significant, I mean between 800 and 900,000, which represents perhaps 4% of the Australian population. Some of them are quite wealthy. We've also been told, Barry, that there is some Iranian activity in Australia. And we've been told this from Iranian diaspora that don't like the Ayatollahs. They want a freer Iran. That there are people in Australia and there's money in Australia with links back to Iran. Again, that's just what we've been told. We don't directly have proof of that, but we think that the Australian Federal Police are investigating those possible connections.
I would suggest that the authorities in Australia look, if you're looking for funding of ideology and even what they may be now calling criminal activities, they should look at Qatar. Or I believe is funding your universities. But you mentioned something there. You said in Australia these days there are between 800 and 900,000 migrants from the Middle East. How many Jews are in Australia?
The estimate of the Jewish population is about 115,000, might be 120,000. So we're probably 1/8 the size of the Muslim population. And this perhaps helps explain the current government's attitude and the current government's attitude to Israel that you were rightly critical of in your introduction, Barry. We have a federal election coming in Australia in the first half of 2025, no later than the end of May. And there are many more seats in Parliament that will be influenced by the Muslim vote than would be influenced by the Jewish vote. So if you want to take a cynical political view, and I think there is legitimacy to taking a cynical political view, then there are people in the Labor machine, the Labor Party machine, who are saying, oh, you can almost afford to throw the Jewish community under a bus. They're not really going to be significant in the outcome of the election. And provided you take a policy stand that will attract the Muslim vote, you will be more successful. So unfortunately, there does appear to be that dynamic unfolding as well.
I agree with you, David. You echo of what I've been pointing out in European country after European country, that the socialists have been playing for a decade or more a very cynical numbers game. And this is why they've allowed in unbridled migration from the Middle East, because if they could help them with social services, etc., migrating into, for instance, Australia, they think this will bring them votes. And with what we've seen in various countries, David, in Sweden, where I've covered it, and in Britain, where after recent elections, the socialists have brought in members of parliament. In fact, in Britain, it's separate parties. In Britain, for instance, where they now have in the British Parliament at least 3 Hamas supporting members of parliament, and this in London, in England, even after one of the Muslim migrants murdered a conservative members of parliament. And yet there they are represented there. They're represented in the Swedish parliament. And I would suggest if they have 800, 900,000 voters, even if hopefully the Labour win the election come spring or summer, you will find some of the migrants represented in your new parliament. Do you think this is a realistic uh, potential for Australia?
Barry, we're already seeing the beginning of that. There is a member of parliament who is very sympathetic towards the enemies of Israel, let me put it that way. Her name is Fatima Payman, recently left the Labor Party to start her own political party. And we've seen a couple of lobby groups modelled on what's happened in the UK. There's one called Muslim Votes Matter, and they are copying the methodology that has been brought some success in the UK. And in terms of the migration, there is something which I think will be of particular interest to your Israeli followers, and that is that our government, the Australian Labor government, leads the world in bringing people from Gaza. I mean, this is extraordinary. This is crazy stuff, but it's true. Australia has approved the importation of approximately 3,000 people from Gaza, whereas other countries have allowed in much, much less. And as I'm sure you know, the Arab Muslim countries are virtually zero. So we've called this out as being extremely reckless, putting Australia's domestic security at risk. Everyone knows that in Gaza, Hamas and some of the even more radical groups enjoy tremendous support. And some of the visas that Australia issued have been approved in extremely short time, 24 hours or sometimes less from application to approval. Can you believe that? It's reckless, it's crazy, and this also appears to be a move to try to appeal to the radical left and appeal to the Muslim vote in Australia.
But if you're saying that the Labour are involved in this, then which is the party or parties then that are going to rescue Australia and bring it back to its traditional values?
Well, there is a number of political parties led by the Liberal Party and the National Party who are in coalition, the Liberal National Coalition, and they are much more positive towards Israel. They have had their leaders go to Israel. They've visited the southern communities and the site of the Nova music festival where the massacre occurred. They have a much better understanding, much more sympathetic, much more aligned with the Judeo-Christian values that would normally underpin Western democracy. And at the moment, because we're approaching an election at most a few months away, there's a lot of political polling to be done. And the trend has been away from the incumbent Labor government towards the Liberal National Party. The most recent poll actually has the Liberal National Party 51% to 49%. So it's very, very close. No one can predict with certainty what the outcome of the election will be. A lot of things can happen, but right now one would have to say that the trend is away from the government. And one of the issues, not the only issue, but one of the issues has been, like in other countries around the world, we've seen numerous aggressive anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, anti-Western protests on the streets. And people are frankly sick of it. It's been disruptive, it's been costly. There's also been the damage, the vandalism, the threats, and in some cases, attacks on the Jewish community. And we do hold to the hope that there is a quiet majority of people who are not vehemently anti-Israel, who are not fundamentally anti-Semitic, but the real test of that, of course, will be the federal election in a couple of months' time.
Well, I want you to know, David, that you have supporters. Another friend of mine, ex-Anzac officer Barry Rogers, and the founder of Beersheba Vision, criticized Penny Wong, and he wrote that she and Albanese are out of step with the mainstream Australia. Hope that's right. And in step with the enemies, he writes, the enemies of democracy after Wong's speech in the United Nations, in which Beersheba Vision described as divorced from reality and morally indefensible in its treatment of Israel. And they said it was unworthy of her and unworthy of Australia. And now Penny Wong, despite advice not to do so, had the chutzpah, using an Israeli term, of actually going to Auschwitz on International Holocaust Memorial Day, ignoring the record of her and her government, what's happening, unfolding in Australia. I put a fairly cynical cartoon on my social media page, but I also understand that, what's his name, Peter Dutton, wrote, I think he's one of the opposition leaders, said that Penny Wong, the foreign minister, was the most inappropriate person to represent Australia at the Auschwitz commemoration, saying it would be insensitive given the Albanese government's position on Israel's war in Gaza. Maybe you could address that issue.
Yes, Barry, and I have met with Peter Dutton, who is the opposition leader and the alternative Prime Minister, and I actually agree entirely with his statement. Penny Wong is the most anti-Israel foreign minister that Australia has ever had. She was pressured to visit Israel after 7 October, like many world leaders did. It took her a long time to make a visit. And when she did finally go to Israel, she refused to go to the southern areas. Can you imagine that, going halfway around the world in order to visit Israel and then not go down to the kibbutzim in the south or to the Nova site? And the Jewish community saw that as outrageous. She has probably done as much, if not more, than any other politician in the country to stir up local anti-Semitism here with her relentless attacks on Israel, which began, incidentally, on the 7th of October 2023. Within hours of the attack starting, the Hamas invasion, and Israel was under the most barbaric terrorism, she issued a statement which included calling on Israel to exercise restraint. Right? You just think about that for a moment. Israel is subject to an unrestrained terrorist attack, and we have our foreign minister calling on Israel to show restraint. So in terms of the importance of the lessons of the Holocaust, the never again, as everyone calls it out, that anti-Semitism is a scourge which needs to be combated through education, through law enforcement, through every means possible. We had representing Australia at the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, a small delegation led by the politician who's probably done more than anyone else to incite anti-Semitism in Australia. She was accompanied by a Labor member of Parliament called Mark Dreyfus, who is Jewish, who is from the left wing of the Labor Party, and he's actually been called out by some members of the Knesset as being also terrible in some of the things that he has said. He opposed an inquiry into anti-Semitism on our university campuses, an independent judicial inquiry, something that's desperately needed. So the fact that he's Jewish doesn't excuse him, and we had quite an unfortunate representation at this event. And I can tell you, I was one of the people who signed a petition which was signed by over 20,000 objecting to her going on this particular mission, given her track record.
And this man carried the name of Dreyfus, very significant name in Jewish history and anti-Semitism, in this case in France. Strange. Look, David, let's see if we can end on some positive note if we can. One of the most troubling centers of anti-Israelism is, of course, the United Nations. However, if we take ourselves backwards, people are unaware how central that Australia was in the establishment of the State of Israel. In 1947, if I got my facts right, your Deputy Prime Minister, Herbert Everett, was the one that guided Israel along the path that led to Israel becoming a United Nations member state. And it was Australia that recorded the first ever vote in favor of the 1947 partition plan, which led to the creation and the establishment of the Jewish state of Israel. Perhaps you can add to that and perhaps possibly add any other sort of positive note you can with vis-a-vis Australia, the Jews and Israel.
You're right, his nickname was Doc Everett, and he was chairing the United Nations session, which had the vote in favour of the establishment of a Jewish state in 1947. Now, he was a member of the Labor Party, and in that era, the Labor Party was completely different to the Labor Party of today. And for most of the history of the Labor Party, it's been reasonably supportive of Israel. We've had a number of prime ministers who were quite supportive of Israel, and that's a good thing. There was until recently what was termed bipartisan support for Israel. Unfortunately, in the last 3 years, that's fallen away very dramatically. But I think the most positive thing to know is that the Australian Jewish community is a very Zionist community by and large. And perhaps like the United States, it has had a tradition of voting a bit left politically, as the Jews in America often vote Democrat. The Jews in Australia have often voted for the Labor Party here. But the most recent poll that was done by the Australian Jewish News shows a massive swing in the Jewish vote for what it's worth. And close to 80% of the Jews in Australia who participated in the last poll by the Australian Jewish News indicated that they would vote against the incumbent government. So I think that the people of Israel, our brethren, can take some comfort that within the Jewish community of Australia, there is strong grassroots support for the state of Israel. And that's a wonderful thing. And of course, as you said also in your introduction, there has been a relatively small number of Jews who, because of the current government, have decided to make Aliyah. But if the current government is returned, I think that number will increase quite significantly.
That leaves me in a dilemma then, David. I don't know what is best. Either you have a change of government and Australian Jews feel safe and stay there, or have me encourage them, in any case, to make Aliyah to Israel. So you've left me with a dilemma. But David, I want to thank you very much for being our guest today. And we all wish you safe passage. And we'll be very, very interested to see how the police are carrying on with the personal people that they have as suspects. And maybe, I don't know who, either this government or the next government will turn things around so Jews in Australia can feel safer and welcome. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Yes, go
Thank you,
ahead.
Barry. We always admire your commentary and your insights. And I can tell you that HAA often shares or even plagiarises some of your work, always with giving you credit, of course, but very much appreciate your insights.
That's good, because I do the research and write the books and the articles in order for you people over there to spread and help me and help support David and others as well who are on the right path. Thank you, David, once again for being our guest.
Thank you.
Friends, those watching, after International Holocaust Remembrance Day 2025, who would have thought 80 years after the Nazi Holocaust, the horrors of an official encouragement of Jew hatred, because that's basically what it's been turned out to be in the name of free speech, would rear its ugly face in the most distant place in Western civilization from Auschwitz, and that is Australia. This is Barry Shaw, and this is The View from Israel.
אנחנו מכריזים לזאת